Prepare for A Rood Awakening.
Shalom. This is Michael Rood at Ophel Gardens on Mount Moreh-Yah in Jerusalem. It was here on the Temple Mount that Isaiah proclaimed that Israel's leaders would enter into a covenant with death and make an agreement with hell in violation of God's covenant with Abraham. Israel entered into just such a covenant on September 13, 1993. It was referred to as the Oslo Peace Accord, named after the city in Norway where it was initiated. The Oslo Agreement demonstrates the keen sense of humor that the Almighty has exhibited throughout history. Oslo in modern Hebrew means toilet seat. And that was one agreement with hell that the Almighty said that He was going to flush. In the spring of the year 2000, I announced if we have accurately corrected the biblical calendar for this year, we will see violence erupt in Jerusalem on September 28, 2000. Looking back, we recognize that was the very day that Ariel Sharon ascended the Temple Mount and read the last day prophecy of Ezekiel. The bloodshed that ensued has continued to this very day, and it is now known historically as the beginning of the Second Intifada, or uprising. This is the very day that the Almighty annulled Israel's covenant with death just moments before its 7-year fulfillment. Join us in the Lester Summerall television studios, where this multimedia presentation on the prophecies in the Feast of the Lord was recorded by the Prophecy Club. This is Bible Prophecy 201. Now, episode 24 in the 26-part series on the prophecies in the Feast of the Lord, Jerusalem, a cup of trembling for all nations.
We see in the scriptures that Damascus is going to be a ruinous heap. Damascus is going to be a smoking black hole on planet Earth. And for that to happen, we don't see much of it here, but the Syrians are the ones that are behind so much of the terrorist activity there that if Damascus were taken care of, then it would end some things. So I believe that what we are about to see, and as this goes out around the world, you will recognize that when they begin making their move against Israel, the terrorist attacks step up, and when Israel comes down with a hammer and is like a torch among the sheaves and incinerates their enemies round about, that you are going to see the United Nations stand up in condemnation against what Israel has done to protect itself. You are going to see the entire world up in arms. All those now who are part of the 18-country tour that Arafat is now on to get their support for declaring the Palestinian state. That right now, he is going around to 18 countries, enemies of Israel, to get their support behind him. This is not an accident that is happening at this point in time. And so what will happen is that when they make their very stupid move, and very soon, that's when Israel will come down, and when that happens, you will see all of the papers in the world, you will see the news media throughout the planet standing against Israel, and there is going to be a fervor. There is going to be a division. You are going to see the Christians in America who say that they have replaced Israel stand up against Israel. You're going to see a division that's going to take place that is going to cause such terror and bloodshed, and Christians fighting against each other even in this country. You're going to see some things shake up in apocalyptic proportions. And that is all going to be to pave the way so that the Gog-Magog invasion will be able to take place. Israel will be completely overrun, and for 10 days there will be no hope for the salvation of Israel at all. As it says in Zechariah, that Jerusalem will become a cup of trembling for all the nations round about them. The whole world is about to shake. It will be uncontrollable because they are going to know what is about to happen. And there's no way to stop it. Bill Clinton can't stop it. The United States government can't stop it. Nobody can stop it. And the world is going to begin shaking. And you're going to wake up one morning and you're going to know that this is it. The hammer is dropped. And you're going to get up in the morning, you're going to get in the shower and let that water pour over you. And after the shaking stops, you're going to then begin to pray and thank God that He let you know about this in advance. And now as you calm down, you have already said that my life is a living sacrifice. I put it on the altar, and now I want to live my life for you. What do you want me to do? And right then, when you get thankful that He lets you know in advance, then you're going to know right down the line, chung, chung, chink, exactly who you have to call, who you have to see, because now, from this moment on, it's going to be a dead run to the finish line. Because this thing, you will know that this is it. Many of you right now do not believe that this is really going to transpire. This can't be the year. And in fact, it may not be. But it can't be done in a closet. It takes time and it takes the movement of troops logistically to make this thing happen. So we are going to know in advance, in that day when you wake up and you know this is it, you are going to be ready. You're going to be prepared, because now we are going to enter into the most exciting, the most dynamic time on planet Earth, and from that moment on, it is a dead run to the finish line. For 10 days, Israel will be overrun. There will be no hope for the salvation of Israel at all. For these 10 days, as the Gog-Magog invasion ensues, it will leave behind a carnage where 2/3 of the people in the land of Israel will be dead. And at the end of that period of time, in which Israel's allies will be cut in pieces, as Zechariah chapter 12 says, that all those who burden themselves with Judah and Jerusalem will be cut in pieces, even though the entire world is gathered together against Judah and Jerusalem, indicating Israel's allies will be cut in pieces. And it would occur to us by reading Ezekiel's account of this Gog-Magog war, that at the same time that Gog-Magog comes against the mountains of Israel, that he puts hooks in the jaws of Gog-Magog, and they go up against the land of unwalled villages to take a spoil. And if there's any time in the history of the world in which Israel's allies are ready for a spoil, it is at this point in time in the United States of America. When we see the droughts that have been happening in Russia and other parts of the world, and what has been happening here, we see that this is a time in which Israel's allies, which will be shredded even though the whole world is gathered against Israel, this is a time that we need to be prepared and expect and prepare for this time. As the prophet Isaiah said, enter into your chambers for a little while, because the Lord will come out of His place to punish the inhabitants of the earth. Shut the doors behind you. Enter into your place for a short season, because the earth will not cover its dead. The earth will not be able to drink up the blood that's poured out upon it. And there is going to be a time that we need to close the doors behind us and take care of things right there and be prepared to wait things out. Because at the end of this period of time, there is going to be a severe carnage upon the planet in which we need to be able to let things just sit for a while, take care of the things at home, the family at home, and then when we are instructed to go out, and this is the time where I believe that preparations for Y2K are not moot.
That's right.
That now is a time that you shut the doors, you don't go out, you make sure that you have got a way to take care of everything for a short period of time, and then when you come out and you take a pot of hot beans and rice over to a family who hasn't had anything to eat for the last month, then you will have a captive audience. You will be able to minister, you will be able to lay out things before them, take your calendar, whatever it takes at that particular point to drive these things home, because this is when your ministry will come alive. Don't go out and try to save the world in the midst of this, because the world is not going to be saved. There is a remnant that will be saved. And right now, the remnant doesn't exist. We are not the remnant. The remnant are those that remain at the end. This isn't the end. We see what some people refer to as the remnant drop off all along the way and have been dropping off all along the way, and there's been no pressure yet. This is a time when Tishri 1 hits. This is when a shaking begins on planet Earth, and it will be from that point on a dead run. For the next 10 days in the land of Israel, we see, with no hope for Israel's survival, that on the 10th day, which is Tishri 10, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, that is when God will fight for Israel. That is a day that God will be sanctified in the eyes of all nations, because he is going to incinerate the armies of Gog and Magog on the mountains of Israel. While the whole world all this time has thought that God doesn't exist, that God has been quiet from heaven, that God's judgment, which has been promised, is not going to happen because God is long-suffering. He's not willing that any should perish. But when his day comes, and when his Sabbath month begins, and when these things begin to go down, we are going to see that God is going to shake things, and he will fight from heaven for his people Israel, and he will be sanctified in the eyes of all nations. They are going to know that God has fought for Israel, and on that day, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, that is a day of the national redemption of Israel. That is a day that has been set aside for the covenant that was made in the Messiah's blood to be confirmed with his people for one Shavuot. That is when the blindness in part that has happened to Israel will be lifted from their eyes. They will look on him of whom they have pierced, as it says in the 12th chapter of Zechariah. Not as he returns in the heavens. That's not what it's talking about. They will look on him of whom they have pierced. They will weep and wail and cry for him as they wail and cry out for their only begotten Son. They will see the testimony that God put in the earth of his Son, that testimony that is greater than the testimony of men. And on that day that the Ark of the Covenant is revealed, that begins the last Shavuot, the last 7 years that will then finish out at the 70th Jubilee from when Israel entered the land to begin with. Now, at that point, when God has fought for Israel, when he incinerates their enemies, then for the next 5 days we get ready, because now we are going to have the Feast of Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles, up on the Temple Mount for the first time in nearly 2,000 years. During that 5 days of getting ready for the Feast of Tabernacles, that's when we're going to clear off the Temple Mount. We'll bulldoze the remains of the Mosque of Omar, and the Dome of the Rock will be cleared from the Temple Mount at that time, and the hundreds and perhaps thousands of dead bodies will be dragged off the Temple Mount, and that is when it's going to be necessary to have the sacrifice of the red heifer. That red heifer, which is born in the land of Israel, a red heifer born to a black and white Holstein cow, and when that heifer is sacrificed, it is not a blood atonement. That red heifer is to be completely incinerated. Its blood, its horns, its dung, its hair, everything is reduced to pure ash. Then that ash is put in water. What do you have then? You have lye. You have disinfectant that if you don't water it down enough, if it's not diluted enough, it'll take the skin right off your body. That is the waters of purification. The waters of purification is disinfectant. It's soap. And that is what? We will scrub down the Temple Mount and cleanse the Temple Mount so that we can keep the Feast of Tabernacles, because what is going to happen at the Feast of Tabernacles this year is a most exciting event. Because the Feast of Tabernacles for 7 days will be celebrating on the Temple Mount. And at the end of that period of time comes the last great day, the 8th day. And again, we look to the Gospels to see how the Messiah prophesied what would take place on this at this time. Because in the Gospels, we have the Messiah interpreting the Torah, interpreting the feast, and we always look at how he interprets and what he says at these different feasts so that we know how these feasts are to be interpreted, what the shadow pictures are, and how they will be fulfilled. And it is at the last great day in which we read about this in the Gospel of John. And the Gospel of John, again, I remind you that it is at this time, it says that Yeshua did not walk among the Jews at Jerusalem because the religious leaders wanted to kill him. But yet, when it comes to the Feast of Tabernacles, he is required by the Torah to go up, whereas he is not required to go up for either Yom Teruah, the Day of Trumpets, or the Day of Atonement. He stays up and out of Jerusalem until this time, and now what he does is he goes up to Jerusalem, sending his disciples in ahead of him, separate from him, and he would go around a different way among people that none of the people would expect him to be with. He would cover himself up, and then when he would get up onto the Temple Mount, then he would be in an area of safety. Because of the thousands of people that would be up there, there's no way that they're going to take him among all the people up on the Temple Mount, because the people loved him. The people knew that there was something very special about this rabbi, but the religious leaders were the ones that were after him. And so it is that I take you to this view of the Temple Mount, because it is here that we read in the Gospel of John, the 7th chapter, about what happens at the end of this feast. And this is the rehearsal that would go on each year. I remind you again that each one of the feasts has a rehearsal that is integral to each one of the three feasts in which we were required to go up to Jerusalem, in which there was an expectation that this is the year that the Messiah may come. Because we know that this rehearsal is put in place for the entry of the Messiah into Jerusalem. And so it is on the last great day of the Feast of Tabernacles, which is called the last great day. And that's what you read in the Gospel of Yohanan. And that is the day on which up in the Temple Mount, as you see on your screen here, the entire Temple Mount is jam-packed with 100 to 150,000 people, shoulder to shoulder, completely packing the Temple Mount at the city of Jerusalem for the festivities of the last great day. It is here, right in front of the temple, that you see at the top of this blue line, which represents the path that the Kohen Gadol would take as he left the brazen altar up on the Temple Mount. He would leave the brazen altar carrying a brazen laver, which has a pole on it, and he would walk down between two columns of priests that are represented by this red line that goes down through here. The priest would be standing shoulder to shoulder across from each other, making a pathway that goes all the way from the altar, all the way down off the Temple Mount, out the gate, down to the pool of Siloam, which is what we see in the King James is called the pool of Siloam, but it is Siloam in the Hebrew, which means the apostle or the sent one. Now, these priests that are forming these two columns are standing shoulder to shoulder, thousands of them, making this pathway all the way down. They are holding in front of them palm fronds, which are 10 to sometimes 13 feet tall, and it is now that they're holding these palm fronds, and they are standing at attention, and they are quiet. And it is the entire congregation is quiet as the high priest walks down from the Temple Mount with this brazen laver in his hand and goes down to the pool of Siloam. Verse 29 of the 7th chapter says, "But I know him, for I am from him, and he hath sent me." It is on this day of the Siloam water oblation that he said that I am the Siloam, or the sent one, the apostle, the sent one. The sent one, just as Moses was the sent one. And now this is speaking, he is saying, I am the Siloam. I am the sent one. I am the one of whom Moses spoke that God would send the prophet, and that prophet you must listen to. And it is so that it is there that he makes that proclamation as the high priest goes down to the pool of Siloam, and then he takes that brazen laver on that staff and then scoops it down into the waters of the pool of Siloam. Just as he scoops it down and brings it up, then the priests which surround that area, the Kohanim, then begin waving their palm fronds and crying out to the top of their voice, "Mashiach come, Mashiach come, Messiah come, Messiah come, Messiah come." And all those priests all the way up that line will then begin in unison crying out, Messiah come, Messiah come, and the Temple Mount being completely filled with 150,000 people who have now broken down their sukkahs, their tabernacles, which on the top of them will be the palm fronds. They are now standing on the Temple Mount with those palm fronds, which are not green anymore. Now they're rattling, and as they wave those palm fronds, and everyone cries out, Messiah come, Messiah come, as 150,000 people cry out together, and you could hear it for miles and miles around as it echoed through the hillsides of the Judean countryside. And it was at that time that everyone cried out, Messiah come, and it happened every year, and this is the time that the high priest made it all the way up to the Temple Mount again, which is about a 15 to 20 minute walk all the way back up that hill, right in front of the brazen altar. And as he got in front of the brazen altar, then the priest up there, shh, and then the hush went all throughout the crowd, all the way back, and everyone held their breath. They held their palm fronds absolutely still. Everyone was motionless because they wanted to hear what was going to take place next. And at that very moment, when there was not a sound, then the high priest would take that water from that pool of Siloam in his laver, starting at the southwest corner, and then he would pour it out across the altar, and it would go shh, as that water was poured out across the brazen altar. And it was right at that very moment, in the dead silence, as he poured out that laver across that altar, that is when the Messiah then threw back his tallit, and he cried to the top of his voice, If any man thirst, let him come unto me and drink, and out of his belly will flow rivers of living water. And when he cried that out, in the silence of that moment, the people said, This is the Messiah. This is the prophet of whom Moses spoke. This is the Messiah. He has just interpreted the Mikra. They have known what the prophets have spoken about the Holy Spirit being poured out in the last days. They know that, and he said, out of his belly will flow rivers of living water. Whoever calls on me and comes unto me. And when these people said, this of a truth is the Messiah, then there are others who said, wait just a minute. Will the Messiah come out of Galilee? And there was a division among the people. But John then spoke these words, This spake he of the Spirit which would afterward would be given, because the Spirit was not yet given, because he was not yet glorified. Now, this is happening at the time of the Siloam water oblation at the end of the Feast of Sukkot. During the Feast of Sukkot is when the latter rains come. And the latter rains are double what the spring rains are. During the Feast of Sukkot, so many years, the water that pours down on the city of Jerusalem will completely wash the streets of Jerusalem clean. It's like after all that summer, that water comes gushing down through the streets of Jerusalem, going down the stairs, and literally washing the whole city of Jerusalem clean. Just a few years ago, the latter rain outpouring was so great in the natural water that flowed out that as it came out of the city of Jerusalem down the wadis out to the Dead Sea, that it swept a couple of cars off from the road and took the people to their deaths, because it's so torrential, the amount of water that is poured out at that time. Well, I would ask you, is this when the Messiah fulfilling what John the Baptist said, that the Messiah would baptize with the Holy Spirit and with fire? Is that when the Messiah poured out the gift of Holy Spirit and baptized his followers with the gift of Holy Spirit at the time of the Siloam or the latter rain? No. He poured out the Holy Spirit at the time of Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks, at the time of the early rains. That is when the Holy Spirit was first given, and the prophecy of Joel came to pass at that point. But the prophecy was speaking of an early rain and a latter rain, and that the latter rain would be a double portion rain and a double portion of the Spirit of God. The Messiah is telling us specifically how that water oblation, how that Siloam water oblation is to be interpreted, because 40 years after his death, burial, and resurrection, the temple was destroyed and the rehearsals at Jerusalem stopped. He is there to interpret it, and his disciples are there as scribes to write it down as he interprets the Mikra, just as it had been rehearsed, letting us know that this is the day. Tishri 22, the day of the latter rain outpouring, will take place at the last great day at the end of the Feast of Sukkot. That is why we are to get ready and get cleaned up now. It's not an option. We either get cleaned up now and get ready, or that latter rain outpouring is not going to be part of our experience. If we want to stay on Mount Gerizim, back in our own religion, our own ways of doing things, then it's going to bypass us, because the Messiah is going right back to Jerusalem. He's going to open the eyes of his people. And just as the early rain came out to the Jew first and also to the Gentile, so it is in these last days. He will open the eyes of his people, Israel. It will be poured out to the Jew first and also to the Gentile. This is the time that we're to get ready.
Since the 1940s, there has been much talk of the latter rain movement in Christian circles. And as Christians have continued to go around in circles for the last 60 years, we have seen that the latter rain movement has resulted in little more than rampant kingdom-building Nicolaitanism. However, the Almighty has a plan for the last days that will shake the religious kingdoms of men to the ground. He has promised to raise up an army of mighty men filled with a double portion of the Spirit and power of God. We invite you to join us again next time for episode 25 in the 26-part series on the Prophecies in the Feast of the Lord, the Last Great Day. This is Michael Rood from Jerusalem bidding you shalom, peace, and I'll see you when the smoke clears.